All right, ready for a deep dive into some pretty pivotal stuff. Today we're tackling the prospect of a Kamala Harris presidency. What could it mean for America, and how it could reshape the global landscape?
Yeah, it's a hot topic everywhere, and for good reason. It goes beyond just policies, right? It's about a potential shift in America's identity, its role in the world.
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Kamala Harris, daughter of an Indian immigrant, a Jamaican-American economist, rises from district attorney to the first female, first black, first South Asian vice president. Now imagine her as president.
Powerful image, loaded with symbolism.
For many, it represents a huge step towards a more inclusive America.
It's significant, especially for young people, seeing someone who looks like them in such a powerful position. Historian Martha Jones, she's written a lot about black women in politics, argues that Harris's journey, well, it sends this powerful message about belonging in America, in its institutions.
It's like the American dream in action. But let's go beyond just the symbolism for a minute. What concrete changes might a Harris presidency bring? Her supporters are excited about those potential progressive reforms across a bunch of issues, healthcare especially.
Yeah, healthcare is a good place to start. Harris has been a strong advocate for expanding access to affordable healthcare, pushing for policies that build on the Affordable Care Act, and tackling things like rising prescription drug costs.
So under a Harris presidency, we could see even more aggressive push towards universal health care coverage.
It's possible it would be a major shift in the American system.
And it's not just domestic policy, right? Harris has been vocal about the U.S. needing to lead on climate change. Could we be looking at a U.S. that really steps up on sustainability, pushing for that bold climate action both here and internationally?
It's definitely a possibility. She's supported President Biden's green energy initiatives, and she's talked about needing a more comprehensive approach to climate change, one that involves working closely with other nations to reduce emissions, invest in renewable energy.
So a potential shift towards a greener America, maybe a greener world. That's a compelling vision. But of course, other crucial issues are in play too, like social justice and equity, areas deeply connected to Harris's background, right, as a prosecutor, as Attorney General.
Right. Harris has this long history with the criminal justice system, and her record there is complex.
How so?
Well, on one hand, she implemented some tough-on-crime policies during her time as a prosecutor, and those have been criticized, for disproportionately impacting marginalized communities.
Yeah, I've heard about those criticisms.
But on the other hand, she's also spoken out about the need for criminal justice reform, advocated for policies to address systemic inequities.
Seems like she's trying to navigate this tricky balance between her past as a prosecutor and her more recent focus on social justice.
Exactly. And it's a balancing act that'll be closely scrutinized if she becomes president. Critics will be watching. Do her actions match her words?
While supporters will be hoping she uses her experience to make those meaningful reforms.
Yeah, hoping she can deliver on that promise of reform. It's a fascinating dynamic, potentially consequential.
Absolutely. And, these domestic policy discussions, they often have international echoes. We talked about climate change, but a Harris presidency could also have a huge global impact on, well, foreign policy, for example.
Right, right.
And this is where it gets really interesting.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about America's role on the world stage. Could a Harris administration, could it actually reshape America's image abroad? Maybe repair some of the damage to its reputation in recent years?
It's possible. She's emphasized rebuilding trust with allies and fostering a more collaborative approach to global challenges.
Working together rather than going it alone.
Exactly. She's talked about strengthening alliances, particularly with countries in Asia, Africa, Europe, seeing that as key to addressing issues like climate change, terrorism, economic instability.
So a potential shift away from that unilateral approach we've seen in the past.
That's the hope, at least for those who want a more multilateral foreign policy. Harris argues that the U.S. can't solve the world's problems alone. Working with other nations, that's essential to achieving shared goals.
An approach emphasizing diplomacy, cooperation over confrontation.
Right.
But of course, not everyone's convinced that this is the right path for America.
There are definitely concerns, yeah. Some critics worry that a Harris administration might be too quick to intervene in other countries' affairs, especially in regions where human rights are being violated.
That age-old debate, when and how America should use its power on the world stage. That balance between promoting its values and avoiding, well, the pitfalls of interventionism.
Exactly. And that debate will likely intensify if she becomes president. Her supporters will point to her commitment to human rights as a sign that she'll be a strong advocate for democracy, freedom abroad.
But her critics will argue that good intentions don't always equal successful outcomes.
Right.
And they'll point to past U.S. interventions, like what happened in Libya, as evidence that meddling in other countries' affairs can have those unintended and often negative consequences.
It's a complex issue, no easy answers. It comes down to a judgment call about how to use American power and when. A decision with huge implications, not just for the U.S., but the whole world.
Okay, so we've covered a lot. Potential for progressive change, the challenges of balancing past actions with present promises, the complexities of America's role in the world.
And we haven't even touched on the economic implications. Her progressive agenda, it'll likely come with a hefty price tag. That's raising concerns among some economists, fiscal conservatives.
Right, because the big question is, how will it all be funded? Could increased government spending under a Harris presidency lead to higher taxes, a larger national debt, maybe even economic instability?
Those are valid concerns, likely to be a major focus of the debate surrounding a potential Harris presidency. Her supporters will argue those investments are necessary to address urgent challenges like climate change and inequality.
But her critics will warn about the potential economic consequences of such ambitious spending plans.
Yeah, they'll argue it could lead to inflation, slower economic growth, a decline in America's global competitiveness.
Classic debate. Those who want government intervention to address social problems versus those who believe in a more limited role for government in the economy.
And it's a debate with real-world consequences for everyone, not just in the U.S., but globally. You know, it's interesting how these domestic policies, they often have international echoes, especially when you think about the economic side of things.
Yeah, like we were talking about with those green policies. I mean, good intentions, but what about those ripple effects across the globe?
Exactly, exactly. Let's say, hypothetically, a Harris administration really pushes for rapid decarbonization, right? Aims to transition the U.S. away from fossil fuels. Now, for the U.S., with its resources and tech, it's a tough challenge, but a manageable one.
Well, for developing nations, those heavily reliant on those fossil fuels, it's a whole different story.
That's the crux of it. Many of these nations just don't have the infrastructure, the capital to make such a rapid shift. Imagine the U.S. starts tying trade agreements or aid to really strict environmental standards.
It almost feels like they're being penalized for a problem they didn't create.
And that's the risk. It could push these nations away from the U.S., right, towards alliances with countries who are less stringent, maybe even those undermining the global climate goals.
So you aim for environmental leadership, but you potentially isolate the very countries that need support to get on board. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Irony and unintended consequences, they're constant companions in global politics. And this kind of brings us to another complex dimension, human rights. Harris has been very vocal about that, which is admirable, but
But the question is, how does that translate into action on the world stage? We've seen past administrations use human rights as justification for intervention, sometimes with disastrous results, like what happened in Libya, for instance.
yeah, Libya is a really stark example. It shows how these well-intentioned interventions can go so wrong. While the motives might be to, promote democracy, protect vulnerable populations, the execution is incredibly complex. And the long-term consequences, devastating.
It's like trying to predict the future, right? So many variables, so many potential outcomes.
Precisely. A Harris administration, with this focus on human rights, might feel a greater obligation to intervene in regions facing crises or oppressive governments. But then that raises the question, where's the line? When does advocating for human rights become interventionism? And at what cost?
Because history has shown us those lines can blur very quickly, and those costs can be incredibly high. And it's not just about military action, right? It could be sanctions, diplomatic pressure, even economic policies that impact other nations.
Absolutely. It's this complex web of interconnected actions, each with ripple effects that are really hard to predict. The world might be holding its breath, wondering what path the Harris administration would take.
Would she prioritize diplomacy and cooperation, seeking to build consensus, work with allies? Or would she be more willing to take that unilateral action, even if it risks alienating other nations?
Those are the crucial questions. And the answers will have far-reaching consequences. A Harris presidency could usher in an era of greater global cooperation, where the U.S. leverages its power, its influence, to address those shared challenges, like climate change, poverty.
But it could also lead to a more fractured world, where the U.S. is seen as this overbearing power quick to intervene in other countries' affairs even when his actions are unwelcome or counterproductive.
It's a delicate balance. The stakes are high. The decisions made by a Harris administration, they would shape not just the future of the U.S., but the future of the world.
So we've talked about those potential benefits and the potential risks of a Harris presidency, both domestically and internationally. It's clear there's a lot at stake, and the choices she would face as president, well, they be incredibly complex.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember these choices wouldn't be made in a vacuum. A president, no matter how powerful, is always operating within a system of constraints, domestically, internationally.
Right. There's Congress, the courts, the media, public opinion, global events. All these factors would influence a Harris presidency, shape its trajectory.
And then you have that unpredictable nature of global events. A crisis could erupt any moment, demanding immediate attention, forcing a president to make tough decisions with limited information under intense pressure.
It's a daunting task, to say the least. So given all this complexity, how can we, as voters, make informed decisions about who we want to lead us? How do we cut through the noise, the rhetoric, to make sense of it all?
That's the million-dollar question. I don't think there's any easy answer, but I think it starts with being aware of the complexities. Recognizing there are no simple solutions, being willing to engage in those thoughtful, nuanced discussions about the challenges we face.
So it's not about having all the answers, but about asking the right questions, seeking out diverse perspectives, being open to the possibility that we might not always agree on the best course of action.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that leadership isn't about wielding power. It's about building consensus, fostering collaboration, finding ways to move forward together, even when we disagree.
So it's less about finding that perfect leader and more about finding a leader who's capable of navigating that complexity, embracing uncertainty, making tough decisions in this rapidly changing world.
Precisely. And it's about recognizing that the success of a presidency doesn't just depend on the individual in the Oval Office. It depends on all of us, on our willingness to engage in the process, to hold our leaders accountable, and to contribute to the solutions we seek.
It's a collective effort, not just a top-down approach. We all have a role to play in shaping the future, both of our nation and of the world.
Absolutely. And I think that's a powerful and hopeful message. It reminds us we're not just passive observers, but active participants in shaping the world we want to live in.
It feels like we're at a crossroads, doesn't it? Facing like two potential paths for America's future. On one hand, you have this vision of a more inclusive, just, and sustainable nation, one that champions human rights and takes a leading role in tackling those global challenges. A nation that lives up to its ideals, not just for its citizens, but for the world.
A beacon of progress, yeah. A nation that prioritizes diplomacy and cooperation, working with allies to address those shared concerns, things like climate change, poverty, conflict.
But then on the other hand, there's this apprehension, this fear that in striving for like rapid change, things could backfire, that pursuing these ambitious goals, however well-intentioned, might lead to those unintended consequences.
Yeah, right.
Economic instability, social unrest, heightened global tensions, maybe even conflict.
It's like the shadow side of progress, right? Recognizing that even the most noble endeavors can have those unforeseen and potentially detrimental outcomes, and navigating that complexity, weighing those risks against the potential rewards, that's what makes leadership so challenging.
So how do we, as voters, as citizens of this complex world, even begin to make sense of all this? How do we weigh these potential futures, these competing visions, and make informed decisions about the path we want our nation to take?
It's a question that demands, well, careful consideration, a willingness to look beyond the sound bites, the campaign slogans,
Yeah.
to really delve into the nuances of policy and grapple with those potential consequences, both positive and negative.
So it's less about having all the answers and more about acknowledging those inherent uncertainties, the unknowns that inevitably accompany any significant policy shift, any attempt to steer a nation, let alone the world, in a new direction.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that leadership on this global scale, it's inherently messy, unpredictable. There are no guarantees, only possibilities, and those possibilities are often intertwined with risks.
So what advice would you give to someone struggling with this decision? Someone trying to decide what they believe in, what future they want to work towards, who they trust to lead them through these turbulent times?
I'd say don't be afraid to embrace the complexity. Don't shy away from the tough questions. Look beyond the rhetoric. Examine the policies. Consider the potential impacts, both the intended and the unintended, and ask yourself, what aligns with my values? What kind of world do I want to leave for future generations?
Because ultimately, that's what this election is about, isn't it? Choosing the path we believe in, even when that path is, well, shrouded in uncertainty.
It's about hope, about striving for something better, even when we acknowledge the risks, the potential pitfalls. And that, I believe, is a pursuit worthy of our time, our energy, our engagement.
It's a reminder that we're not just spectators in this unfolding drama. We're active participants. Our voices matter, our choices matter, and the future, both of our nation and of the world, depends on our active involvement.
So to all our listeners out there, we leave you with this.